So I want to thank Robert Best on our team for helping us get this together. He got pulled in last minute to make this possible. I think we're going to get to a bunch of interesting questions today, but for those of you who haven't met him before, this is Arthur Brock. He's one of the co-founders of the Metacurrency Project, which is the bunch of rebels that have started Holo and Holochain. And I'm Matthew Schutte. I'm working with them for, I guess I've been here for 3 or 4 years now. Art, I think most of the people out there are interested in hearing, okay, so net neutrality just got repealed today. What does that mean for Holochain? And what does Holochain mean for net neutrality?
Well, it's hard to know for sure what it means for Holochain. At the moment, for our network protocol, we're actually using libp2p, which comes from was part of the IPFS project from the same people that launched Filecoin, Protocol Labs, that kind of stuff. I'm not sure we're sticking with it. We've had some problems. We've made some fixes, but we're looking at some other options. And at least one of the other options we're looking at is designed to disguise itself as regular internet traffic, whatever that means. And so if we use something like that, then net neutrality may or may not, affect the ability of Holo boxes and Holochain peers to talk to each other. But how Holochain may affect net neutrality is more a question of the apps that we start building in that ecosystem, and if we can start moving more of the functionality into our own hands. And I think we're a ways away from this next goal, but I'm going to call it a stretch goal, which is to also start hooking up mesh network antennas to the Holo boxes and start just skipping over the ISPs, and if that's how we want to play.
Lots of people have had interest in mesh networking in the past. Is there a way that Holo makes that easier or makes it more likely to succeed?
Well, one of the key things is that Holochain doesn't care. It has its own address space anyway, in terms of the peers talking to each other. It's not really using IP addresses. IP is just a transport layer. IP being internet protocol, that is the primary protocol routed through most of the routers on the internet. But we can really use anything as a transport layer that's pretty configurable. And because it's a serverless architecture, it's really a peer-to-peer architecture, being able to use a mesh network layer and run an application that's peer-to-peer is kind of ideal, because you don't have to be chasing to backbones to web servers or that kind of thing necessarily. You may be able to grab it cached at a local peer.
Cool. All right. So for those of you following along, please ask questions in the comments, and we'd love to be able to make anything that you've got questions about answered. One of the questions that came in previously was, is there support for proof of concepts? Which I think is like, could mean, are we going to help people build their stuff? But Art, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to iron out the kinks really in making it smooth to come on as an app developer. Our focus really has in the past more been on just getting the platform up and running, and now we're shifting some attention to really trying to make that smooth for newcomers to jump in and be able to get up and running. So because we actually do want to encourage a lot of applications. For one thing, Holo as a hosting platform is not very useful if we don't have applications running on it. And I think Holochain's credibility really is going to rest on others building on what we've building on this platform, building on what we've built. It's one thing for us who have built it to say, yeah, we've built a distributed Twitter and a distributed Slack and a distributed Fractal Wiki and the beginnings of a cryptocurrency platform. And it's one thing for us to say that, and it's another for others to actually try building on it and prove that, oh yeah, this can be done. It's accessible, doable.
Yeah,
So,
keep going.
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, but one of the things that we were doing at our hackathons, we just had a kind of hackathon tour in Europe, Barcelona, Liechtenstein, Riga, Latvia, Porto, Portugal, and Bristol, UK. And one of the things that we were offering at those events is some cryptocurrency awards for the Holo currency that we're going to launch for apps that actually get built and shared and published to our app store, essentially our Holochain of Holochains. And I think we're interested in doing that right now, but not just a blanket statement. Not. I think you have to attend a hackathon or make some kind of connection and get a little key to be lined up to receive that. We do want to support groups that are building these things.
Yeah, I'll say that there's a few different types of support that we're trying to offer. One of the main ones is just join our conversation community on Mattermost. I believe the link is in this chat already. And there's hundreds of people already there, some of whom are deeply technical. They're building Holochain applications. They're playing with this stuff. They're working on the core infrastructure. And then other folks who aren't so technical. They're more interested in what can be done with this, what kinds of new patterns of community and coordination become possible, and they're exploring the whole gamut. They're going, well, is this possible? And then people who are more technical are going, actually, yeah, you could do that like this. So there's one layer which is free, which is reach out. There's a burgeoning community that's starting to grow that you can turn to sort of begin exploring the space. Beyond that, we have some perks on our Indiegogo campaign at the moment for helping people work through a proof of concept for an application, right? We've got one perk that has to do with getting guidance on the design of your app. And I think that's like $450 or something from somebody on our team. And then we've got another perk that has to do with bringing us in to help your entire team learn how to build Holochain applications over, I believe, a one-day workshop. And that's probably something that's more appropriately suited for either a larger community that's looking to build peer-to-peer applications for themselves, or an organization, a corporation of some sort. There's a ton of corporations over the last few years that have poured resources in their research and development departments into exploring blockchain. And unfortunately, many of them have experienced, hey, that's kind of like one tool that doesn't fit any of the problems that we have very well. But we think there's something in this space that might be interesting. We think Holochain is a much more flexible tool in your toolkit for doing distributed applications. And so it'd be probably for those that I think it's $9,500 training options, probably for an organization that's looking to explore in that way. We've got a question here, which is kind of related. One question I've had from friends is, how will the dev training camp work? Any places around the world that have been decided where they will pop up in 2018? Will we do some online stuff? What are your thoughts, Art?
The dev training camps are a more respectable name for, I think, what we've been calling hackathons. And I'm not sure if we're going to have format differences between when we're trying to do one that's more corporately respectable and one that's a little bit more grassrootsy. But I mean, the basic gist is, let's jump in, get you oriented, and start trying to build some things together. It's a bit of an experiential, like some hands-on, let's take some steps together to actually build something. And we have a lot of locations that are on the horizon. In fact, I want to see if I can pull up a list because it's so large. But we're looking at ones in Australia, the US, probably San Francisco and Oakland, and there's one maybe in Ashland in January, Vancouver, British
British
Columbia,
Columbia.
sometime soon. We've got people pulling us over to Copenhagen. We've got some slated for India. Um, what am I forgetting? Probably a East Coast, New York or Boston
Hmm.
one. Um, maybe Montreal. There's a group wanting to bring us up there as well.
Yeah, I envision us doing at least one or more online versions for folks that happen to be far away from those places. Um,
So I've got the list open now. We've got Berlin, Geneva, Copenhagen, Sydney, Australia, Czech Republic, Belgium, Japan, London, Stockholm, Ashland, Oregon, China.
just all of China.
Yeah, that's not a very specific location, but
Cool.
yeah.
We've got another question here. Can you talk about the distinction between decentralized and distributed systems, and why is that distinction important in the crypto space?
Well, truthfully, there's not total agreement about those terms. And then there are confusing pictures that people put out, and sometimes they're labeled differently than the same version of the picture put out by somebody else, just to, add to the confusion in this space. When we say distributed, what we mean is peer-to-peer. We mean full peers, not special class nodes that are miners that are needed. So the way I think of decentralized versus distributed is that it's fully distributed to each peer equally. Peers are full equals. In the case of most blockchain systems that are operating on a large scale, there's sort of special class peers that are doing either proof of work mining or proof of stake betting, gambling, um, and nobody else is allowed to write to the blockchain. You have to hand your transactions to one of those nodes for it to get written into the chain. And in the case of Holochain, every node is an identical node running identical DNA. In fact, that's how you know that you're on the same Holochain, because unlike blockchain with like one big monolithic thing like Ethereum's smart contracts all run on one monolithic blockchain, Holochain, each Holochain app is its own Holochain. It's its own address space with its own peers, and only the people running that app are participating and talking to each other. And how they know that they are the right people to talk to is that they have that DNA, that hash of the code, as their very first entry of their local chain. And so everyone's an equal peer.
Yeah. For me, that distributed architecture is kind of like the difference between that and a decentralized architecture is sort of like a community where everyone is literate and they're able to write, and a community where you have only a priest class of scribes who are literate. And so if I wanted to send a message, I've got to go find one of those guys and have him write it for me. And then he ends up spending his time doing that. He's got to get compensated in some way. And so it's a very different architecture. It's an architecture that actually concentrates power at a particular layer, as opposed to a distributed system that spreads it across the whole community. The other piece for me that's interested there is the way that a distributed system actually fosters a more vibrant ecosystem, where a distributed network more easily connects to and bridges across to other networks, because each of those participants being able to speak into this one space ends up being the bridge between more than one space, and that's not controlled by a group of scribes or miners in the blockchain world. We had another question. If Holo was so it says, why the Holo crowdfunding does not appear on Indiegogo homepage. So this is no longer the case. But we were the top trending project on Indiegogo, and then we got muted. And it had to do with their legal team kind of getting worried that people might be confused, that people might think we were selling cryptocurrency by saying we were selling a box, but really you're going to get a bunch of cryptocurrency. And it's no, you're going to buy a box and then you're going to do some work and others will compensate you for doing that work. But they asked us to make some changes and it took a few days for us to get unmuted. Meaning, yeah, so that was not awesome for us because 3 days into our campaign, all of a sudden, like, hey, nobody can find us unless they literally search for our name on the Indiegogo site, and so our sales went down significantly. But we still managed to raise our entire 2-month goal of $200,000 in 4 days.
Yeah, 3 days and 6 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah, in fairness, one of their terms of use is about you can't pay people to buy your product. And they were confused about the cryptocurrency thing since people can use Holo boxes to do hosting and then get paid for providing that hosting. They were reading that like we were going to pay people to run the crypto boxes, like it's us paying them as opposed to the app providers that they're servicing. And so that their team freaked out about that a little bit. We got delisted, while we were the #1 trending campaign, and
which is like, wow,
for 5 days.
For 5 days at the start of a campaign. Yeah. Like, oh man. And from my perspective, it's like, hey, it's hard when you're doing something new, right? When you're trying to do something new, people are like, wait, what is that? And new is scary.
Especially around cryptocurrencies, while they're trying to also start to explore doing ICOs. But
yeah, do you want to make that visible? What happened? When did they launch their ICO platform?
The day they brought us back online.
So I'm sure they were a little sensitive, right? They were worried that they were going to raise a flag with a regulator or something, and right as they were getting ready to launch their own thing.
Yeah, because it's a tricky thing navigating the whole SEC securities stuff. So
yeah, because none of it's super clear.
Yeah.
Yet. Which actually brings up something else. So, because we've gotten a few questions about this. Hey, we're doing you. I've heard you guys are doing an ICO. When, where, can we do it in the US? Are we doing it in the US, et cetera? Can you just make that visible a little bit? Because this touches on that SEC stuff.
We're doing an ICO. It's scheduled for January 9th. There's still a possibility of that getting rescheduled depending on how a few things go with some regulators. The ICO is not being offered in the US except for some qualified investors who would need to go through our whitelisting process, unfortunately. But we are trying to make other ways for people in the US to participate. And the crowdfund is one of those ways to actually get in on being able to earn the currency with a Holo box, and instead of buy it up front.
Yeah, and for us, part of the reason why we're not in the US is related to the lack of clarity here. I heard somebody else on another project recently go, it was actually Brock Pierce from EOS and a bunch of other projects, but he was talking about how he recommends to every one of his projects, don't list in the US because you can only raise about 15% of your capital, but you get about 90% of your regulatory risk there. And we had gone to a bunch of attorneys and tried to get guidance on where should we set up and how should we do all this stuff, and they basically were like, yeah, you might just want to avoid that.
Yeah, and we've done a lot to try to make sure what we're offering actually isn't a security, but because the ICO itself is offering an ERC20 token that's transferable, until we launch Holo and you redeem it in for Holo credits for the hosting credits, the pre-sale of hosting credits could be, as a non-transferable thing, I think could be safer than the ERC20 token. But, part of the reason people buy these tokens is kind of to gamble with them, which is sort of what makes it a security.
Yeah.
Even if it's not an equity stake, there's still the risk that it could be interpreted that way by the SEC.
Yeah. So some folks were asking, what's the status of the crowdfund now? We are unmuted. We're back online. So we're on some of their trending pages.
Yeah, you have to go into the marketplace. It's not just on the Indiegogo homepage. They now have sort of sorry. They have, I'm just looking at it right now. Where's the categories? Oh, I'm logged in, so I'm not seeing it. But they have like marketplace and the post sale, just buy things. If you go into the marketplaces that the campaigns, we're listed there.
Cool.
Oh, wait.
All right. What else? Can someone explain this to me in simple terms? Like, practically speaking, how would a group of people use a device like this, and what would it allow them to do? I can try to take that. So the first thing is, if you are not interested in this stuff at all, you're just like, hey, I want to try something out. And the Holo ports that we're making available on Indiegogo, the reason we're doing those, you don't have to buy one to participate in Holo, but we're doing those for to make it easy, right? It's a plug and play device where you can buy it, you can plug it in, you hook it up to the internet, you go, and it earns cryptocurrency for doing some hosting work. So it's literally bridging between some peer-to-peer application, or probably many different peer-to-peer applications, and websites that are accessible to anybody who types in a URL in a browser. And for doing that bridging, you get compensated. So that's the first piece, is just earning cryptocurrency for your computer doing some hosting work. The second piece is you can actually start to use these Holo ports, but also your other devices to run Holochain applications, meaning applications that work the way that you want them to work. So it's the things that people have gotten interested in are things like peer-to-peer Twitter, or peer-to-peer Facebook, or peer-to-peer Airbnb. And the thing that gets interesting there is that that system can work the way that the community members want it to work, rather than the way that some set of investors need it to work. So if you want to use Twitter without having ads blared at you, our peer-to-peer version of Twitter doesn't have ads, and it won't need to have them to support hosting, because you take care of the hosting by participating. So your participation kind of pays your own way. What else? Art, you want to take the next question, or any other questions?
Sure. There's a question here from Justin. Can Holochain be developed in IBM Bluemix? I personally haven't used IBM Bluemix. As I understand it, it has been rebranded IBM Cloud, and I've used Google Cloud and Amazon and DigitalOcean Droplets, but I haven't used IBM Bluemix. I think they have a lot of the same kinds of things, including just the pure compute and API type stuff, which you might be able to install Holochain, the Go executable, as a pure API thing. But I think what you really want to do is you would need just a full cloud server. I'm not sure how we would configure it just yet for the just the compute or API thing, because what happens is that a Holochain app actually needs a WebSocket to be able to be talked to currently, and then it opens inside of a virtual machine inside of the Go application that is Holochain. So you write your app in JavaScript or Lisp. Those are the two virtual machines that we have at the moment. We may add more, or other people may add more. But like if you want to build a JavaScript app, that has to run inside a virtual machine, inside of the Go thing, and so I think you're just going to basically have to set that up as a virtual server. You certainly could do that on IBM Cloud, or you could do that on any kind of device. We have executables now, releases. We have our second alpha release that you can just download, unzip, and run. You don't have to actually install all the developer infrastructure. Um, that's the answer, I think, to the mix.
Cool. Luis asked, can you explain what is an ethical cryptocurrency? What do we mean when we're talking about trying to do an ethical ICO or an ethical cryptocurrency? I'll take a little swipe on the ICO side, and then I'll leave Art to answer the ethical cryptocurrency side. So we've seen a bunch of projects in the blockchain space raise money in ways that look irresponsible, for at least some of them, and we are trying to seed and grow a particular ecosystem. We're trying to grow a transition to a version of the internet where individuals are in control of their own data, they're in control of the applications that they run, and they're also in control of how those applications connect to one another. And because that's what we have as our vision, we're trying to take the steps to bootstrap that into place. And we have our own sort of beliefs about how that should be owned and controlled by the members of the community itself. And we're setting up Holo as a mechanism for creating some funding and some incentivization, but we're also isolating that from the Holochain infrastructure that sort of is the core, and we're attempting to use that to help subsidize this. This is not an uncommon practice in the world of open source software that you find one thing to help subsidize another. On the ICO side, we have decided, hey, it would be irresponsible for us to raise far more money than we need to bootstrap this thing. But how do you know how much money you need? And so we've taken a two-pronged approach. We've got our crowdfunding campaign and we've got an ICO. In the crowdfunding campaign, we're selling hosting devices to people who are interested in work and doing the work of being hosts. We're also selling developer trainings and other things like that for people who are looking to actually build applications to run on Holochain and make use of, literally become the client side for these hosts who are going to serve out connections to people on browsers. That for us gives us a signal about how big the ecosystem is or is going to become. And then we're able to use that to go, okay, if that's how big we're going to be, we can forecast out, we think we'll be this big over the next 12 months. That means we've got to support this large of a community over that period of time. And so we're actually adjusting how much supply we're willing to offer based on the participation demonstrated in our crowdfunding campaign. And so the ICO has kind of this unusual structure because we're actually limiting what we're willing to raise from other folks. We're basing that limit on participation demonstrated in the crowdfunding campaign. In addition to that, because it's really important for us to have the this currency and this ecosystem actually held in a distributed way, right? We're aiming for a distributed web. So we're trying to make sure that this isn't just all the currency is controlled by 3 guys. We've done a number of things to attempt to limit the ability for Bitcoin whales, basically, or more likely Ether whales, to just gobble up all of the supply of currency that's put on offer. And I can let Art sort of expound upon that if you want.
Yeah, a couple things, because he actually asked it about it being a cryptocurrency. I think that it's funny how quickly patterns, even bad patterns, get established, and people kind of reify them. They think that it's the only way it can be. Is that what cryptocurrencies are gambling tokens, completely decoupled from any real world value or anything like that. And I don't think that's the only alternative. The way we've designed the Holo currency is actually to give it a center mass that the supply is actually coupled to the computing capacity of the Holo network. So the currency itself is basically backed by computing power, which seems to be in almost infinite demand. And not saying instantaneously infinite, but a growing demand. So that is the beginning of a a sort of suite of currencies we'd like to see rolled out in an ecosystem, like energy backed, housing backed, food backed. I think if we can design cryptocurrencies for greater stability and connected to real world value of goods that humans actually need, then what we really have started to do is create a viable alternative to the current economy that is completely peer-to-peer, decentralized, and the money systems that make it up are backed by things that individuals have the power to produce or provide. And instead of specialized, privilege of banks or, something like that. And I think that's just laying a different foundation for a more equitable economy. And that's why it's kind of a more ethical cryptocurrency. And same with the ICOs. I think there's a lot of things that you can do to make your ICO more accessible to normal humans and not just the big crypto speculators, and make it safer for people, lower risks and that kind of thing. And we're really, I mean, the ICO space is kind of fresh and exciting and new. It's like, hey, we have sort of reclaimed our ability to fund things that the SEC has, largely made impossible. And so we'll see how long that lasts. But I think the chances improve if we regulate ourselves better, if we actually raise that bar of integrity and make it so that it's harder to attack all of these things for fraudulent behavior and even unintended, even accidental mistakes, like the schism that's happened in Tezos, like that kind of thing where, I don't think there was any intended fraudulent behavior, but
yeah. Can you talk a little bit about why a mutual credit system might be useful for this kind of cryptocurrency, this asset-backed cryptocurrency? What's the advantages of doing that instead of tokens? And for a little background, we're instead of doing money like tokens, we're doing credit, and we're doing a mutual credit system. So can you just expound a little bit on what that is and why it might be beneficial?
Yeah. So most there's a really weird use of the word fiat in this currency space, right? Most crypto tokens are created from nothing by miners or stakers. And that's actually what the word fiat means. It's the ability to speak something into being from nothing, and the crypto space has taken to calling national currencies fiat currencies, which is true, but they pretty much have mirrored all of those same problems, and almost worse in many ways, in the space where they're trying to provide an alternative. And we're saying the problem isn't with being a cryptocurrency. The problem is with not seeing some of the deeper patterns of currency design. And so being mutual credit, for one thing, nothing is ever created from nothing, right? Every credit has an offsetting debit. So the credits we pre-sell in our ICO, when Holo launches, the Holo organization will have a negative balance of all of the credits that we sold and have put into people's accounts. So you'll be able to see how much we essentially borrowed from the community and where our progress is on repaying that. And for us, that's a part of increased transparency, accountability, visibility of these things. Because the revenue model actually has to do with small transaction fees, little nano transaction fees on microtransactions, we have to provide really 100 times the value, at least, to the network to be able to earn that back. And
so our effectiveness as a catalyst for facilitating a bunch of hosting work and value transfer is what actually enables us to pay back the debt.
Yes. And then the responsibility for the software and security and the parts that actually are centralized, not due to the crypto aspect. Like Holochain is totally decentralized, but because Holo is bridging back to the web, we have to do things like provide DNS resolution services, and that's kind of centralized, right? People have to um, be able to rely on us for that as a service.
Yeah. So because we're bridging back to the centralized web, we've got to speak the languages of the centralized web. Um, cool. Let's see some other questions. Is there anything in particular that you want to pick off from the list that we've got here?
Well, I mean, I would just do the next one, I guess, from Tristan Roberts
Yeah.
about has Holochain needed to deviate from some of the rebooting the web of trust approach to things with self-sovereign identity, verifiable claims, decentralized identifiers. Um, we have a an early app that we've built. So there's Holochain, the Holochain core, and then there's a whole bunch of sort of core apps that provide core services. One of them is our DPKI, or Distributed Public Key Infrastructure, which, um, for those of you that have ever used a cryptocurrency and lost your keys, left had it on a phone that got lost, or something like that, you lose your key, you lost the money, right? It's the same thing. The key is the only thing that controls the money. You lost it, it's gone. um, Holochain, on the other hand, is setting up a continuity of history over time for your actions in different contexts and different applications. If you lose your device that has your source chain and private keys on it or something like that, you can use DPKI. Whatever, you can use a different key revocation method. Let's say, for example, you have 3 out of 4 of your friends uh, that you communicate with and say, hey, I need to revoke this key, and you've authorized them as an M of N, SIG for key revocation. Then you um, can revoke those old keys and regain control of your identity and your balance, if it's a currency, or your whatever, your Facebook account, your social media tool, your Slack groups, whatever the app is you're using. If you had connected it to your DPKI for key management, then you'd be able to reclaim that. And yes, it is self-sovereign identity in that regard, completely decentralized. It's hash of a public key being used in all of those cases, but you can issue new keys because there's also a permanent identifier that the keys are issued linked to. So
Yeah, and I'll say I've been part of the rebooting Web of Trust community since it started. So has Arthur. We were both at the first event. This is really an event on working on designing new distributed identity systems for the internet. Some of the other folks that were there: Vitalik Buterin, the founder of Ethereum; Juan Baptiste Benet of Interplanetary File System; 3 of what was at that time, I think, the 5 Bitcoin core developers. Like, I mean, it was a pretty amazing group of folks. And underlying this is this idea that individuals should be in control of their own identity, and that we should that or more specifically, that we shouldn't have to rely upon some centralized party, some government, or um, series of large corporations for issuing identity. And a lot of the folks in that community at the moment are really excited about blockchains and what blockchains can do there, obviously, because we're creating something that's built on an alternative to blockchains, where we're working on holochains. We're coming to slightly different architectures, but with similar ambitions. And I'd be interested to see, Arthur, do you think that DPKI, that Holochain's DPKI, will get used by some blockchain systems and some other systems for doing their own key revocation? Will they turn to this?
that's an interesting question. I think part of that has to do with how much work goes into making Holochain an easy kind of side chain or state channel uh, architecture that hooks in with things like Ethereum or something like that. then if people have done the work to do those integrations, then it may be able to do something like that. But it's not going to help you with tokens, because a token's identity is the key. And so you can't revoke the key on the, like it is the identity. There isn't a different identity for it.
Yeah. Cool. All right. We've got a question from Philip Beadle. He says, can you please talk about the difference between Holo and Ethereum as an app host?
Sure, I'll jump in on that. So, for those who are tracking the Ethereum world, you may know that CryptoKitties, basically the trading of little digital drawings of cats that you can breed with other cats to make strange new features and then sell and that kind of thing. The CryptoKitties is kind of bringing Ethereum to its knees. The gas price apparently for processing has gone up by an order of magnitude, gone up by a factor of 10 times in the past couple of weeks, because there's actually an application running on Ethereum now. Many people don't realize that Ethereum doesn't really run apps. I don't know if people have noticed, like there were all these dreams of building the Uber alternative on Ethereum and that kind of thing. And it's turned out that doing that computing on the Ethereum chain is totally impractical. Like we have been setting up for our ICO, and just to like post 10,000 addresses to a whitelist, for example, will take us an hour and a half of using up basically a quarter of the processing of each block, with skipping some blocks because you can't get it in every block in a row necessarily, just to build a mapping of 10,000 addresses. We basically built the same app in Holochain as a part of our experiment in pegging these things to each other, and it took basically less than a second to to do, and then it would take a few minutes to be able to replicate out to the DHT, because the DHT is eventually consistent. But I also forgot to mention that it used about one full Ether token, like in the budgeting, to do that. The gas price was about one full Ether token. That was before the price went up 10 times in the last week. So now it would cost us
$5,000.
yeah, $4 to $5 to just post a list, just to make a white list of 10,000 addresses who could be participating in our ICO. So computation on Ethereum is not really practical. It's like you pretty much have to do everything off chain, with little side chains and state channels and that kind of stuff. And what Holochain, on the other hand, was specifically designed to make computation on scale, the ability to run apps like a Facebook or a Twitter or Wikipedia or Uber, in a completely peer-to-peer manner. Uber is maybe not the best example because it's probably still going to go off to hook into a map API from a centralized provider or something like that. But other than the mapping stuff, all of the rest of the interactions can be happening in app on Holochain.
And that just has to do with the different drivers having their GPS constantly updating, something akin to that. If that's
you're talking about the mapping stuff,
on Uber.
No, I'm just talking about the mapping data. Like, what you wouldn't necessarily even want to put that in your app. You'd probably be using like a Google
got it
service or OpenStreetMaps or a thing like that. That
do you see somebody doing a Holochain mapping app in the next year or two?
Don't know. It'd be interesting.
Or does Google have too much of a
Google has a pretty big head start, but OpenStreetMaps has, I think, kept up reasonably well with the space. And there's so much interesting data being collected from like self-driving cars now, or Teslas that are semi-self-driving. And, like you've got all this map data being refined now in massive volumes.
Hmm.
very up to date, and I don't know that there's a good way of sharing it yet.
Let's see, what else? Any chance in one of you is giving a talk from the crypto side at something like RSA conference? I don't think we've applied to do any of the RSA type events. For those of you who aren't familiar, that's a big security computer security conference that usually is here in San Francisco. Is that correct, Art? I think it is.
Sorry, don't know.
I think RSA is normally here.
Yeah, and I think in fairness, we're basically using other people's crypto algorithms that they've written, like for wire protocols or for doing the hashing functions and the signing functions and the encryption functions. We're not necessarily low-level crypto geeks. I think we are, our strength lies more on kind of the social engineering side, like understanding how to pull these things together in a way that actually builds community, social coherence, makes sense at the level of workability. Um, and then obviously we code those things too.
This was Jerry Brower. He followed up with, "You guys really need to give a tech talk." Yes, thanks, Jerry. We'll try to do more tech talks. What else? Is it possible to create other coins above Holochain or as Holo apps that convert back to Holo fuel? This is Julio Montero.
First, I want to say that Holo's fuel is not a coin. That may not have been 100% clear from what Matthew was saying about it being mutual credit, but it's not token centric. It is what we call agent centric. So it's actually about tracking the interactions between people, and you can replay their history and check all of their history. So you don't even need consensus because you can 100% validate your counterparty's state and make sure that they are not, that have never entered an invalid state. It doesn't matter what other people have said. As long as you trust your version of the running app, you can make sure that every transaction you do is safe, basically. And so Holochain is this crypto distributed app fabric. It's basically for building intrinsic data integrity for us to all spread the data around many different users and be able to make it easy to run apps. One of the apps that you can run is currencies. We actually, in the Riga hackathon, built our first currency app on top of Holochain, a little transactor thing that was targeted to backed by Transportation Project. These little bike-like scooter things that they were looking at having there be a sort of community-held transportation force of these things. Anyway, so the intention is that there be many currencies that can run on top of Holochain. I would not recommend building them as coins. Nico and I were geeking out a couple weeks ago about, like, would it be worth our while to implement Bitcoin on Holochain just so people can see you actually can do it? And then Holochain would be exactly as inefficient as, Nakamoto consensus and proof of work and all that kind of stuff, but you could do it. Like you could actually do that if you wanted to. We're encouraging a different direction because if you implement things as coins, then you have to manage consensus. And Holochain does not automatically come with any consensus algorithm. It allows you to deal with data collisions at the app layer, so you could make certain choices about that because it's set up where everything isn't about rival data. See, the thing about blockchain is that it basically has one killer app: tokenization. And tokens are rival, right? That when they're coins, we have to have, we can't have different copies of the same coin and then be able to spend them, right? Because whose is the one that gets to count. So since it's basically what the primary app that blockchain does is deal with a rival data thing, that's not what Holochain is set up for. Like, who cares if we tweet the same thing? Did we just have a collision? No, we just tweeted the same thing. Like you can. That's not rival data. It's okay to tweet the same thing. Um, if two people invent the calculus, then it's anyway. So the point is that for generalized computing, if you want to really build a platform that's efficient for that, you don't want to take on the overhead to treat all data like it's rival data. What you want to do is to be able to, in those cases where the collisions matter, be able to have ways of taking control and resolving that collision.
Yeah, one of the things for me that's really that makes this kind of visible is with the blockchain approach, you end up collapsing a bunch of different perspectives from the vantage point of each of the participants in the community to a single perspective, a network-wide perspective. And you're basically randomizing who gets to add the new, this 10-minute history. And it's just one person, one party gets to add what they saw over that 10-minute history. And that feels, um, of course, that couldn't support a regenerative system because it's by definition a monoculture. It's a way of manufacturing a monoculture out of a bunch of different participants. And monocultures don't tend to thrive. They tend to be really brittle. They tend to have all kinds of problems. It's not that that couldn't be useful for anything. It's just that its utility is really limited. And we're trying to enable some very different and more vibrant social patterns. Somebody asked me a little while ago for an example, and I think I've given this on one of these talks in the past, but what's an example of a distributed system that doesn't need consensus? And I like email, right? It would be really terrible if I had to know what order you had received email in before I could figure out which order, we don't have to know what the ordering of our emails was in order to be able to use email. It might be useful for me to know that I sent this and then I got a reply. Like that ordering could be useful, but that's ordering from my perspective, not from some global network perspective. And as a result, email is far more efficient and can handle much more bandwidth than blockchains can. So Gary asked, could a massively scaled holochain supplant the internet? And are you Satoshi Nakamoto? I loved the last part. Art, are you Satoshi Nakamoto? Not with the amount of smack talking that Art has done on the blockchain architecture. I would venture probably not.
Yeah, no, nobody on our team is Satoshi Nakamoto. I'm pretty sure about that. But we did actually publish a lot of these same kinds of things about um, our design around the same time his white paper came out. We just unfortunately took a little bit longer to get around to building it, which allowed a big energy wasting pattern to get set into place that now everybody thinks is the only way to do this stuff. But then the question was also about like, could this sort of supplant the internet or something like that? Potentially. I just want to be careful about saying that in that Holochain does not have a generalized transport protocol. We ride on top of the transport protocol and we use internet protocol for most of that because that's the transport protocol that gets routed over the internet. So a lot of people don't necessarily know these different aspects, but in terms of like, could it replace the way we do a lot of apps and websites and interfaces, UIs, peer-to-peer patterns, money, that type of stuff? Yes, it could probably replace those things. Could we be influential in getting some other transport protocol adopted? Maybe, if there's wide-scale adoption of Holochain, but it's just a different space, a different layer that Holochain runs right now.
Yeah. A couple other questions. Bjarke Jorgensen asked, and I apologize if I got your name wrong, if I pronounced that poorly. What kind of hardware integration stuff is in the pipeline? I'm thinking about Holo for Arduino, Raspberry Pi, or Android phones. Is this something you're looking into? Art's
I'm
trying to.
having problems unmuting. I'm like push, push, push the keyboard button. Um, we have run on Raspberry Pis. The Holo Port Nano is a Raspberry Pi like device. It's currently probably going to be the Banana Pi, but that's the manufacturer relationship we have lined up for it. But it could change as long as we actually meet the specs that we're promising. Um, we haven't run it on phones yet, and part of that is just because we've just been so focused on and the underlying architecture that we haven't been focused on the client side much. In fact, our first alpha release we did a few weeks back. We didn't even do a Windows version of it because we hadn't tested it on Windows in so long, and now we um, fixed fixed a couple of Windows socket and scripting bugs and did a Windows release on it. But theoretically, the Go stuff should compile to be able to run on phones, on Android and iOS, supposedly. We haven't done that. The other thing is that in our next refactor, we are probably going to be building a bunch of this on V8, a JavaScript engine, which does run on in browsers and on phones and that kind of thing. And so we know that we can run significant portions of the Holochain system if it's built on that on the client side, which is part of what we're trying to do, so that people, even from a web browser alone, can be in control of their source chain.
I'm going to actually jump to a different question that I had seen earlier that might be appropriate with that as the launching point, and it was asked by Jean-Francois, and it was basically, um, oh, how will Holochain and Holo affect the life of a poor Indian, like poor as in impoverished, not a lot of money, Indian in India? Won't it just serve the privileges or the privileged with technology and education? And I think the part of what we're trying to do here is to make it so that there's a fairly low barrier to participation. You have access to a browser. You want to comment on that, Art?
Yeah, actually, totally. I had a call a few weeks ago with a group that wants to work on mutual credit currencies in um, developing areas in Africa and India in particular, where they actually can use something like um, holochain applications, even places where there's poor internet connectivity. Because one of the fun things is when you have a peer-to-peer architecture, you actually, as long as you can reach the peers locally, you can still be talking to each other and still have potentially a strong enough image of the space between you to be running. Holochain is designed for that kind of resilience. So the idea is that you could give digital money. I mean, more and more smartphones are getting into people's hands, even people that are, poor people, whatever, somehow end up with these smartphones in their hands. If you got a smartphone, you've got a few holoports around, you have some local Wi-Fi or mesh connectivity. You could even be separated from much of the rest of the internet and start to run a little digital uh, economy there with your own currency, even when you're poor in the national currency. Um, and so there's, I think, a lot of things. The thing for us is that wealth isn't just about money, and it isn't just about the national currency. It's really about our capacity to coordinate and create together. And what we're trying to do with Holochain and Holo is have massive upgrades in our capacity to coordinate with each other on every scale, small and large scale. And I think that affects everyone. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And the fact that the barrier to participation is so low feels really important to us. It feels really critical that you not have to own a supercomputer in order to have a voice in how you're wanting to communicate, what the signals are that you want to pay attention to, what the currencies are that you want to pay attention to, not just money like currencies, but other things like, do you pick your kids up on time, or any other form of reputation information. Michael asked, would you consider Holochain itself an operating system? Art, you want to talk about how Holochain is or is not an operating system?
In the way that EOS is an operating system, yes, Holochain is an operating system. It is a platform for running applications, which includes some protocols for those applications to talk with each other. But it's not an operating system in the way that you would normally think of an operating system for a device. Holochain is actually an offshoot of a project called Scepter.
CEPTR.
Exactly what I was about to say, which is short for receptor. It's built from fractal receptors. And Scepter is much more like an operating system in terms of being able to run lots of layers and interface with lots of protocols on a device, as well as be distributed across the network in this way. Holochain is us taking one part of Scepter, building a standalone version of it, basically to compete against blockchain. Because blockchain is so hot right now, we wanted to take this part of Scepter to market where people could actually just see it as a clear alternative to something that was beginning to enter people's awareness. So we do have a plan for a direction in which this becomes more of an OS, but it's not so much Holochain as much as Scepter.
Yeah, and I'll just say, just to reinforce, Scepter is a distributed operating system, right? Not just an operating system. It's not like this works on your computer. It's that it works across a network of devices. Paul asked, Arthur, could you explain a bit about the randomization that Holochain uses? I understand it's one and the same as the algorithm used to sort people into neighborhoods, which means it needs to be deterministic, right? And does this randomization help prevent an attacker gaining control over a large part of the network? I think he's really getting at, I don't think he's asking it in this way, but I think he's really referring to how people get sorted on the basis of their hash. Is that right?
Yeah. So it is deterministic. It's not random in that sense, where you won't know the outcome, except you don't know the outcome in advance, typically, of a good cryptographic hash. So basically, the deal is that we're using SHA-256 by default in Holochain. It's actually configurable. You could configure it to be using a different hash algorithm. And you create some content. Let's say we do a transaction with each other, and there's content in the transaction. There's some description and amount, and then there's links to both of our prior transactions, and all that kind of stuff. That goes into this transaction. We hash that transaction. That's where it gets stored in Holochain's distributed hash table.
Can you say we hash that transaction? Unpack that just a touch.
So hash algorithms are basically like a way of generating a fingerprint for data, a unique identifier where if you run data through this hash algorithm, it'll always come out with the same big number, the same identifier. If you change one tiny little thing, it comes out with a very different one, not just like one off. And that's why it's random, is because you can't predict the hash of a good hash algorithm. You actually have to produce the content and get the hash. But then every time that content is produced, you get the same hash. So in that sense, it's not random. It is deterministic. And then what happens is, the way that a DHT works is that every node on the network, every agent or node or actor, person on the network has a public has a public key that gets run through that hash algorithm, and that the hash of their public key becomes their address in the same address space as the content is being stored. And so now that everybody is in the same address space, the stuff and the people storing the stuff are in the same address space. You can have a nearness algorithm to determine who the nodes are that are near the stuff, and that's who has to hold the stuff. That's the short answer. We're currently using the Kademlia XOR nearness algorithm and routing table for our DHT stuff.
But the basic gist is the same architecture that you're using for randomization is much of the core of blockchain, right? Like part of what happens at the core of blockchain is you can't predict what the hash is going to be in advance. You have to actually run the content through, and that ends up being useful for a variety of reasons. One of which is you can share hashes and people can see this little number, and Art described it as a big number because it's a number that's so big it's larger than the number of atoms in the universe, but it's still only 256 characters or something like that, right? So it's a little string that you can pass around. It's not a gigabyte video file that you're passing around. And even though other people can see that, they don't necessarily know what the content is that fingerprint refers to, or it was generated by. Other questions? Someone on the chat website asked, and our chat website again is on Mattermost. You can find it on our webpage, holo.host or holochain.org. Do join. We've got hundreds of community members there having really good conversations. One of those questions was, would there be any practical way of integrating zero-knowledge proofs into an app's validation rules? For example, for a more private mutual credit currency where you only need to know that an agent's credit limit can handle the money that they're about to give you, that they've got enough.
I'm not sure about that particular example. We'd have to drill into it, but there certainly are cases where you could use zero knowledge proof type things if you want. Plus, just to be clear, and there was another question someone else asked about public versus private data. I think I want to just sneak that in right now with the zero knowledge proof part as well, is that unlike blockchain, where everything is published to one big monolithic blockchain and it's public, Holochain has public and private entries. So you can write things to your source chain that do not get published to the DHT that everybody else can see or query. Now, just like on blockchain, you can encrypt things that go to the DHT, but the problem is, then you also have to give out the decryption key to things, and those things are permanently published out in the open. And if the encryption algorithm or the key or anything becomes compromised at some point, that data was already public, and there's nothing you can do about it. With private entries, you can use the hash of the private entry shows up in your header chain, where it shows that there's been a private entry committed here, and it would even show what type of entry it is. But it doesn't show you the content of the entry, just the hash of the entry. Now you can use that for different types of you can even use that for some kinds of zero knowledge proofs, really, like actually I don't want to go down that road. You can use that for selective exposure of information. So you could do things that could, like an authority could validate your driver's license or passport sign, and you could have a hash of that kind of thing, and that authority could validate your age. You could validate your age against that thing without exposing your birth date, or validate that you're over 21 or something like that. You could even do things like trust claims, where you could say, I confirm that this guy's first name plus last name is this hash, right? And then when he exposes that information from a private record to you, you could add the first name and last name, run it through a hash, and you'd see who has validated, yes, I know this person, and confirm that this is. So that's a kind of a proof without exposure, without exposing the information. It's not exactly a zero knowledge proof, but it accomplishes some of the same kinds of things. So Holochain gives you a really good variety of ways to compose that stuff that you don't quite have the same freedom with in blockchain.
Great. Julio asked a couple of questions. I'm going to go into one of them. Will it be possible to run traditional apps on Holo hosts without any code change? Otherwise, how much do you need to change?
It's funny. I think Sam Rose, I'm not sure if he's tuned in. I think he's sort of trying to experiment with doing that right now. Um, Fundamentally, I think the answer is no. You can't run traditional apps on Holochain without making some changes. And the difference boils down to data centric versus agent centric programming. So we were just, Eric and I just today were looking at the DAO contract that comes, what's it called, a blockchain Congress contract that comes as a sample on the Ethereum homepage. We're looking at as part of our benchmarking of performance against Ethereum, implementing that kind of thing on Holochain. And you just have to think about things differently because it's, it creates a definitive list of the votes and, is managing some central set of data, just like the coin way of thinking. There's a definitive list of coins that exist and, that sort of thing, where what you would want to do on Holochain is actually have a voting action that a person took and is signed by them and is linked to the proposal. And so you can see what their vote action was and that it was signed by them, but you're not creating a data structure. You're creating a place where actions of people are attached to. And so it's just there's just a different way of thinking about it. And like at the Porto Hackathon, we were working on one of Luis's ideas for a disaster response system and looking at different things like supply chain, like when things are donated, where do they go? Do they get to the people who need it? And, it's easy in an object-centric, data-centric way of thinking is as if each item has an RFID sewn into it or a barcode stuck to it that you could just scan, and it's as if you would think of it as if the items are moving around and you're tracking items. But in Holochain, the way to do it, and I think actually the more responsible way to do it, is that you're tracking provenance. You're saying this person in this place or time or whatever, has control of this thing, and then they turn it over to this other person who signs that they've received it and now they are responsible for it. And if it disappears while it's in one person's care, then who's responsible for that. When you pretend you're tracking a barcode moving around or whatever, if the package disappears, who was responsible for that? And so it's just a different way of thinking. It's an agent centric way of thinking. The sources of agency that can make change to the system is how you have to organize the system, as opposed to the data that gets changed. And so there's a little inversion that takes place, and I think in many cases actually leads to better system design. But that's
I mean, it reminds me of back when I've run a few different things in my life, but at one point we were running a surfboard company, and the accounting when you're doing manufacturing can be complicated for just this reason, right? You have a bunch of raw materials that come in and then they get assembled into something that then goes out. And it's not like, oh, I bought wood at this price and then I sold wood at this other price. I bought wood and I bought foam and I bought resin, and then those things got converted and transformed into another object, into a surfboard. And then that got sold at a different price. And the accounting for that, our current systems don't do a great job of making visible the transformations that occur. And particularly across multiple organizations, right? Not a single organization, but you take that problem and you make it into a supply chain problem, it becomes even more difficult. Cool. What else? We've got a question on the consumption of bandwidth by the Holo ports. Are any specific networking bands required? Like, is there a specific minimum upload speed to support this? Thoughts, Arthur?
Um, the truth is we haven't done enough large scale testing of our gossip to give you a fair answer. I think a lot of the large scale testing we've done by spinning up hundreds of Docker nodes all on a local network. So we haven't really put the bandwidth stuff to the test of hundreds of real nodes or thousands of real nodes out there in the world talking to each other. So it will take some bandwidth. Part of the thing, if you're talking about Holo, of being able to serve end users, there will be some advantage that boxes that with higher bandwidth or lower latency from the user would have for being able to provide the end user experience. But part of the thing that happens is the eventually consistent gossip. So even if you're on a little bit of a slower connection, that's okay for the eventually consistent gossip because that's not part of the it's not part of the immediate user experience. It's part of the sustained data integrity or resilience of the system. And so it might be that if you're on some slow ass internet connection and trying to run a Holo box, that you may not get as much traffic routed to you as the lead in the interaction, and that you may end up largely being a backup device for the other boxes that are doing it, and then you would mostly just get paid for the gossip then. That's actually what convinced me. We were originally planning on just doing CPU bandwidth and storage, and we weren't doing gossip as a separate thing. But when I realized that this actually is a niche, people that have a slow connection can still be data backups for others, and that actually provides value and resilience to the network. That we had to break that out into a fourth piece.
Cool. I assume that those folks would be getting paid for gossip only on the Holo related activities, not for all the things in every Holochain that they're participating in. Yeah. And gossip, as he mentioned, is really just about backups. There's more technical detail there, but we can just think of it as backups for right now. What else? We've got taxes, a question about taxes. Robert Best said, I had a chat with Victor Zonders recently about his local food project, also a software project that he's looking into running as a Holochain app. The topic of taxes came up. How do taxes fit into the Holo ecosystem? You'll never have to pay taxes again.
Yeah, that's tough because Holo isn't constrained to political boundaries or geographical boundaries, and taxes are, right. So there's places where sales tax counts, and places where income tax counts, and places where VAT, and if a person builds an app and doesn't take any of those things into an account, then most places, as far as I understand it, make it your responsibility to self-report. One of the things that I like about the architecture of Holochain and Holo is that we are not a centralized record keeper. We are not in other words, like if you're running a barter exchange that's using some kind of electronic credits and that's being run through somebody's server, they're a centralized record keeper, and they're required to report all of the commercial activity to the IRS in the United States anyway, on 1099-B report, electronic reports, and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, because we're not a centralized record keeper, we don't have all the transactions. the networks distributed through the DHT has the transactions, but we don't have all the transactions. I think that I'm hoping that that actually allows us to run currencies like that and not have any reporting requirements, because we're not running the currency. Each person is running the currency. They have their records signed in an immutable chain. You know, we're not holding central records. And so what I think this means in most places is that it's going to be a function of self-reporting. When the app is set up, there's no central record store. There's nobody who can do the reporting for you.
So we've got another question here, which is, we kind of have a little series of questions, but one asks about a combination of DAT and IPFS. How would Holochain differ from that combo? Are you familiar with DAT, Arthur? I'm not either. I can talk to IPFS. IPFS is a distributed file storage system. The main difference is that Holochain is not just doing storage, we're doing processing. So we're able to run peer-to-peer applications, not just peer-to-peer file storings. And that feels pretty different. It's the processing of information that actually distinguishes this stuff. So we're able to do things like peer-to-peer Facebook, not just peer-to-peer Dropbox, right? The other question that might be a little more interesting is, if Holochain were fully developed, what would Scepter add? And this is related to another question that was, how does the Scepter project integrate with Holochain? So, and I'll take a little bit of a stab here. So Holochain was basically the next step in our roadmap. It was the next thing that we were planning on building as part of the Scepter project, but we decided, instead of doing it as a continued component of this larger system, to break it out as a standalone module, make it so that other people could use it independently. We are planning to make use of it as well, and we're going to be releasing additional sort of standalone modules that play well with it, that we'll be able to kind of wire together and configure. But what's the next? The more interesting question might be, Art, what's the next piece after Holochain and Holo?
Well, the next piece I'm not sure is exactly part of Scepter. I think the next piece for me is sort of the Commons engine, taking what we're doing for Holo in terms of building a secure a currency and a secure mutual credit type of currency, and to have it be asset backed by production that people can provide, and then spawning a bunch of those. I'm just feeling some pressure of getting that out there before things unravel in mainstream economic systems and the crypto economic systems, the crypto gambling systems. Feeling some pressure to get that stuff out there so we can actually have a stable crypto economy that meets some real human needs. But I think one of the next big pieces that we're going to go back to for Scepter is the self-describing protocols. Not sure how much of that will get implemented for Holochain, because Holochain is missing the underlying deep level semantics that are built into Scepter, which is part of what enables the self-describing protocols, and Semtrex, the semantic tree regular expressions. But interoperability is a thing. It's a big deal, right? And I think Scepter has a great answer for this. Holochain has a good answer in that it lets you compose at the edges. It lets individuals compose at the level of their own node. You don't have to have that whole big abstract system talk to another big abstract system. I get to talk as me across both and build bridges there. I think that's a good thing, an improvement, but I think it can go even further. And I think that's one of the next pieces we'll go back to in Scepter.
I guess, and the question for me becomes, sorry, I'm getting a little feedback from the Art. The question for me becomes, as we roll out these the protocol for pluggable protocols, right? These self-describing protocols. Will it be fairly straightforward for people who are running a Holochain application to be able to upgrade to something that can support that, or will that be really painful? What's your thoughts on and will the bang for buck be worth the effort from their perspective?
In our recent design session with Eric and Nico and I, where we were looking at some of the refactoring we want to do on basically the programming API, like how Holochain apps are represented internally as a tree. We started weaving back in a bunch of the scepter distinctions of the semantic alternation between symbols and structures, and started making that structure more akin to the way things are structured in Scepter. So that may help with the migration of apps from Holochain to Scepter, because if they have a similar internal representation, then we're good. But again, the thing that's missing in Holochain that is built in at a low level in Scepter is the low level semantics. In Scepter, you can't store an integer. You can store a shoe size or a street address or an age or something like that, but it has to have semantic application. And in Holochain, it's operating more in the sort of regular data space, and
yeah. So one thing I'll point out is I don't see. I mean, I think we're going to start trying to work on that next step of essentially re-implementing stuff we've already built in Scepter as a standalone thing in maybe a year, possibly a touch sooner, but that we'll start doing that work then. And so it's probably not going to be until sometime 2019 before we start seeing any of that self-describing protocol stuff come into usage. Is that right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think Eric is chomping at the bit to get back to it, but the truth is, if we launch these things on this scale, we're going to have a lot to be responsible for before we can put our attention back to Scepter.
Yeah. Okay. Somebody, Julio also asked, how will app hosts be allowed to borrow or get credit? Who can borrow and who decides how much? So I think this really has to do with credit limits. Do you want to talk to that a little bit, Art?
Yeah, I think, as I recall, he was also asking questions about the mutual credit currency. So in the case of the Holo currency, because it's different for different ones, right? In the case of the Holo currency, it's people connected to the supply or capacity of producing the distributed computing. So hosts and maybe app providers and app developers but hosts for sure will have a credit limit that grows based on their history, based on their earning history, essentially. There's a few anti-gaming aspects in there that make it not just a function of their history, but it'll be correlated to that. So, your previous 3 months or 6 months or whatever of earning history will extend basically the kind of credit limit you could draw against. The other thing is reserve accounts, because Holo Fuel is a little bit of a hybrid mutual credit and backed currency, in that we let people buy hosting services through the Holo organization, put in a reserve account, use the proof of reserve, proof of deposit to extend the credit limit of the Holo Fuel side of that account, so we can pay the person in Holo Fuel that just bought it in dollars or euro or Bitcoin or ETH or whatever. And then hosts in the network can redeem back out to those currencies. And we can see in their chain, we can see their hosting history, such that we can make sure that they're only redeeming those. You don't get to redeem out just because you have a balance. You can only redeem out for providing the asset that the network is based on. And the other major account that can borrow is the Holo organization itself, that is essentially borrowing up front in this ICO, right? Like we're basically, and part of how we're, again, like Matthew said, we're trying to determine how much to borrow is through this crowdfunding campaign to gauge demand. Like, are people ready for this? How many people are we going to have to support? How big a community are we going to have to support? And we want to scale our ICO to basically cover that first year, and hopefully at the end of that first year have the system be self-sustaining.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I'm getting my own feedback. Thank you. It looks like that ecosystem is going to be bigger than we were anticipating initially. We were kind of blown away by the amount of demand demonstrated in the crowdfunding campaign. We've had hundreds of people sign up and participate. We've raised well over the 2-month target that we had set of getting to $200,000, and we haven't even started the ICO stuff yet. So, nor have we done hardly any press. So it's going to be interesting to see where this thing goes. We are at about an hour and a half. I would like to wrap it up. Are there any other questions in here that you see that you're like, that's a good one to pick off as the last one?
Just Jerry Brower also asked, what stopped a huge data center from starting mass Holochain hosting or Holo hosting and getting all the money such that they can outcompete the individual hosts? So, in one way, nothing stops it. I think one of the things is that they will be a little slower to move because they won't know whether to take Holochain seriously until there's a network of people doing it. And the other thing is that you don't have any of the pooling benefits that you have from like blockchain mining and staking. So some of those dynamics that tend to concentrate power for the blockchain apps do not apply here. So I think this is predicated on seeing some of the patterns that have happened. Like there was back in the day, you could mine Bitcoin on your laptop, and now without massive resources, you can't really compete in the mining space. We don't have those same dynamics, I think, for the hosting space, and there will be dynamics where you may have lower latency. Like if you are a Comcast customer hosting near other Comcast customers requesting, you may have lower latency for them to get to you and even higher throughput for them to get to you than somebody on the backbone in the Bay Area or something like that. They still have to cross the whole country to get there. And, so there are some advantages to having this be pushed out at the edges is that people are consuming at the edges. A big massive data center can't be everywhere all at once, but the little hole ports kind of can. So there are
and
some,
not just hole ports, but all the other devices. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I'll take on one last thing. We had a question about is Holochain a fit for self-driving cars and IoT devices? The one thing that has been really obvious for me for a long time, IoT meaning Internet of Things, all these little smart watches and smart sensors and smart thermostats and smart toasters and whatever, right? The idea that those things should have to speak back to the centralized internet or even back to a whole blockchain network in order for them to interact seems totally silly. So from my perspective, Holochain, because it enables interaction and decision making and action taking to happen at the edges between two peers at the edge of a network, and not having to communicate to some larger whole system or data center or whatever, it feels completely critical. Anybody who I've talked to in the world of IoT. When I describe Holochain to them, they immediately go, "Oh my gosh, this is this is what we need for Internet of Things." And my personal take on it is this is actually how the body does sense making. That we think about it as if the brain is doing all the sense making, but anybody who knows biology knows no, there's some information processing that happens there, but lots of it happens at the edges. The eyeball, for instance, does most of the processing. Only about 1% of the information that your eye takes in actually gets communicated to the brain because it's doing information processing and filtering at that layer out at the edge. Yeah, and I think it's going to be our project has done a lot in terms of focusing on what are the lessons that we can borrow from nature and how natural living systems organize themselves that we can make use of. Do you have any thoughts or comments on that as a goodbye, Art?
I wouldn't want to use Holochain and self-driving cars as part of the control systems or real-time feedback stuff at the moment. The real-timeness, I think, is yet to be proven or demonstrated. What kind of lag there may be introduced by the eventual consistency of systems and that kind of thing. I think we need to have some time to experiment with that and really stabilize that. So, but as far as other aspects of self-driving cars, in the same way that you were just talking about Internet of Things, other things that are not like the control system, like, do I stop for this, obstruction in the road? Though some of that may actually be useful in a peer-to-peer sense, like being able to talk to neighboring cars rather than through centralized networks. That kind of thing could be useful. And yeah, Internet of Things, it's like, I think of the Holoport. I actually think of the first benefit of the Holos, of the Holoport, is being able to have it be a home base, sort of a base camp for your own Holochain apps, right? Like, it's where your data is being backed up, and you may run something on your phone or your laptop, but you know that you've also got kind of a home base plugged into your router at home. And then there's the extra hosting for other people that you can get paid for. But I think even just the aspect of having a little base camp for yourself, I think the same thing works for the IoT, Internet of Things devices, is being able to have that little base camp, which then that box with a little bit more power can do the internet connections and gossip with peers and coordinate stuff. But so they just do a little bit of local communication. I think that's good.
We will be doing another one of these next week. Oh, I was muted. Sorry. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in. We'll be doing another Q&A soon. I think we have an event tomorrow. Is that right, Art? I think there's a talk scheduled tomorrow. Not sure that that's on Facebook Live.
Yes, Holo Sapiens webinar at 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific, from
9 p.m. GMT.
Yeah, from Homo sapien to Holo sapien, with Fernanda and JF, talking about transitions we're in.
Yeah, JF being Jean-Francois Noubel. Until next time, thank you very much. Go ahead and check out our Mattermost. For those of you who haven't dove into it, you can read the green paper. Art had an interesting interview this last week with Hampus Jacobson, I believe. And yeah, feel free to ask questions. We're going to be doing an interesting series of Holo chats coming up over the next few weeks, where we interview various folks, put some blog posts out, and ask the community to start participating in that conversation, or tagging things relevant to it. So that should be a pretty fun conversation series. Thank you very much.